Climate change, the big picture. What is it? Why are we not acting on it? And what can we do to change this? I'm a physicist, have worked as a petroleum engineer for 25 years, and gave this guest lecture on climate change for a postgraduate renewable energy course at the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, Europe's oil capital. Talk about global warming and climate change was around when I was at university 30 years ago. At some point after that, I started working for an energy company. I thought Shell was an oil company, but what was made explicitly clear to me when I joined, there is no long-term future in oil. Oil would not be around forever, and they were on the road to diversification. I know now that oil and gas will either run out after having destroyed most of our societies and environment, or we'll stop burning it because we don't want it to destroy our societies and environment. But this wasn't clear to me until I decided to take some time off recently and look into the whole climate change issue a bit deeper. This is what I found. Confusion. Climate change is related to everything. The information seemed confusing, often contradictory, and covered the widest range of subjects, with sometimes clear and sometimes very tenuous links. It took me almost 6 weeks to get an overview of the problem of climate change, which I would summarize as follows. Small causes and very large effects. This is how it works. A small increase in our atmospheric CO2 causes a slight warming of the Earth. This can then trigger a large number of consequences, some making this warming process itself irreversible, some having a serious negative impact on all people and societies on Earth, not just now, but all people and societies in the future of the Earth. Some consequences having an impact today on basic needs like water and food availability, some capable of destroying entire ecosystems, and some just out hanging around for curiosity's sake. Interestingly, there is little doubt about the mechanism or what causes it. Governments, corporations, and scientists all agree we're doing it. Most are counting on it happening. Most agree the consequences will be horrendous and ought to be prevented. Emissions are the cause, global warming is a first small consequence, climate change one of several large consequences from that. Where the disagreement starts is if and how we should be doing anything about it. But let's start with the small causes. Technically, climate change works like this. Looking at the image on the bottom right, the sun's rays hit the Earth and warm it, and the Earth reflects and radiates some of this out into space. This heat the Earth is trying to get rid of gets held back by some gases in the atmosphere, mainly CO2 but also methane, nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases. A stable situation is expected to be possible with an atmospheric concentration of less than 350 parts per million CO2 and less than 2 degrees warming. We are now at 400 parts per million and 0.8 leading to 1.6 degrees warming. So a little bit of warming with large consequences. The first on my list of consequences are those making the whole process irreversible. Melting of the ice caps and the tundra are two of the scariest ones, and because the ice caps are most visible, that's where we often focus. Ice caps reflect the sun's heat. As the Earth warms, there is less ice, so the Earth reflects less and warms up more. The second one is an additional consequence of the ice cap melt. Ice melt, together with some temperature increase, causes sea level rise. A few meters by the end of this century, more than 15 meters when it's all gone, and warming is at 4 or 6 degrees. This meltwater also radically changes ocean currents with disastrous consequences for people and sea and other life. The third consequence, ocean acidification, is independent of the climate models. It's a direct consequence of the carbon emissions, is already damaging corals and shellfish, and is getting close to killing off plankton, and thereby the rest of the marine food chain. That's if we don't kill it by overfishing first. The fourth is what is most easy to see, an increased intensity of storms, floods, and droughts, destroying people, infrastructure, animals, and food and water. These are all huge consequences, each capable of radically damaging our ability to live on Earth. Let's look at the top two, the melting of ice. Remember that we are currently at only 0.8 degrees average warming above pre-industrial temperatures, and we're already heading for 2. The graph on the left illustrates glacial thickness loss since the 60s, 14 meters on average. The plot on the right shows thickening and thinning of glaciers, and the rate is indicated by the size. It is obvious that the red dots, indicating thinning glaciers greatly outnumbers the few thickening ones, as illustrated by the blue dots. An illustration of the scary beauty of it all I saw a few weeks ago in the film Chasing Ice, in which photographer James Baylog and his team record the shrinkage of a number of northern glaciers in Iceland, Greenland, Canada and the USA, with time-lapse photography showing a tremendous reduction of coverage and thickness of these great ice sheets. He also set up a film team at the calving point of the Ilulissat Glacier, also called the Jakobshavn Glacier, in western Greenland. They just sat there and waited until this happened. Click on the image to start a 4.5-minute YouTube clip from James Baylog's film, Chasing Ice, or else wait to continue the presentation. These things are happening now. The consequences are huge. The loss of volume is enormous. As James Baylog witnessed elsewhere, many glaciers no longer extend during winter. And as you can see from the diagrams, these are not individual anecdotes. Glaciologists analyze these things happening nearly everywhere. Meanwhile, South Pole sea ice is thinning and spreading, while North Pole summer cover has dropped dramatically and is reducing at an accelerated pace. So he said, small problems, potentially huge consequences. Why don't we just take away the small causes? Some emissions cause some warming, create huge potential for disaster. How about reducing some emissions, stopping some of the warming, and we live happily without these disasters? Well, let's have a look at how big this small problem really is. Our emissions are the cause. We all agree that we need to keep warming below 2 degrees average, and that means cumulatively burning no more than 565 gigatons of CO2. At our current rate, that will take only 15 years. When I saw this, I thought, what? 15 years only? How on earth did we get into this situation? Let's have a look at how we got to the amount of greenhouse gases we now already have in the atmosphere. We started producing too much greenhouse gas, let's say CO2, when we started burning coal in our machinery in the 1800s. We had a pretty good idea that this could cause a problem well before the year 1900, but we knew it was a serious risk in the 1950s. We still increased our emissions radically, and then in the 80s we knew we had a big problem. In fact, even the United Nations, not usually known for its speedy response, decided to create the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, to ensure more clarity in the research findings by getting climate scientists to work together better and verify each other's work more, all to get more unambiguous answers. Let's take that trend and see where we think we're going in the future. This is where we are. I've extended the plot to include the century we're now in, up to 2100. And this is where we're headed with our emissions if we do nothing. This graphic is roughly based on data from the IPCC, which matches the IEA and most other oil and non-oil predictions. That's not a reduction, that's an accelerated increase of emissions. Now what we need to do to have a reasonable chance to prevent disaster to stay under the 2 degrees is this. We need to ramp down our emissions from the current level to zero well before the end of the century. That's something completely different from what we're doing. And if we wait another 7 to 10 years before doing something, this is what we need to do. Instead of ramping down over the better part of this century, we'll then need to ramp down to zero in a little over half the time. And if we leave it for another 15 years, of course, we'll only have a couple of years to ramp down to zero. Because burning the red sector of our predicted emissions is a recipe for worldwide disaster, excluding no one, for all, and also for all future generations. Just for curiosity's sake, what would this have looked like if we'd acted in the 80s, when we knew we had a serious problem? We would have had almost 2 centuries to convert our total economy and society, instead of the few decades we have now. Alright, so here we are. This is the original data graph, the wrong direction we're still headed in at the moment, going up, and where we need to go in order to stay under 2 degrees warming. To better understand what we need to do, it's useful to have a quick look at why this delay happened. Was the science not clear? It was. Did people doubt the scientific approach? No. Did we have climate scientists at all? Yes, we did. Did we not care? Do we still not care? I don't think so. Did we hope to inhabit the moon and Mars instead? Well, not sure. Was maybe something holding us back? Let's have a look at the numbers again, where we are now. These are the numbers we looked at earlier. We need to stay below 2 degrees warming, so we need to emit less than 565 gigatons. So if we do what we're doing now, we've got only 15 years before we hit the point of no return. Who could possibly be bothered by our collective action to change this? Well, this number, 2,795, is the number of gigatons of carbon which the oil and gas companies have currently in their proven reserves. This means on their books. This means it determines their share value, how much their companies are worth, and of course also the executive salaries and bonuses. As you can see, this means that 80% of this amount of carbon needs to stay in the ground, cannot be sold, has no value. Now that's not a problem for the world, not for the people, not for the economy, not for our happiness, not even for global development. But it appears to be a huge problem for the oil executives and their financial backers and bankers. So how big and influential are these carbon companies? To get an impression of this, we can have a look at last year's Fortune 500. I've taken the top 22 only, so it fits on a slide. These are the largest companies in the world. Most of these large companies are here directly because of our fossil fuel addiction, and a few because of globalization and consumerism. If we need to stop emitting carbon, most of these companies will need to dramatically change or go out of business. They don't like change, so they've decided to just stop anything happening and dig in their heels for as long as they can. These companies are more and more part of the world's power structures as business takes over from people in many democratic and governmental processes. And a truly substantial change always causes an upset to the existing power structures, because it tends to create new and different ones. The people who control the current old power structures are a large part of the problem. So what about the solution? Is there anything we can do about this? Well, yes, there are several routes we need to take in parallel. First of all, there is the legal route. If we can get a legally binding agreement in Paris at the United Nations Climate Conference at the end of this year, we can work within current power structures and make the change. I think this is worth fighting for, because it is the simplest possible solution. Please keep this in mind and support this process with all your efforts. But to get results that really work, more is needed than just changing the laws. Yes, we need institutional changes, the law, governments, regulations, but we also need a change in our personal attitude and approach to what is important in life. This slide lists a few things which could help, but what it really boils down to is this. We need to consider carbon emissions in everything we do. Given a choice between short-term economic growth and reducing emissions, we need to choose to reduce emissions. If we don't, there won't be economic growth later. And let's not forget, economic growth is not good for the creatures of our Earth. In the short term, it's good for companies, banks and governments who want to spend more than they have. In the long term, it's a mistake. For our future energy supply, renewable energy, we have some specific challenges. By 2100, which seems a long way away, our emissions will need to have dropped to 10% of what they were in 2010. But let's look a bit sooner. By 2050, which is before I'll retire, we'll need to have converted 80% of our total energy supply away from carbon. The IPCC states this is for renewables, nuclear and carbon with carbon storage. Keeping in mind that nuclear has a carbon intensity problem and timeline problem, as well as substantial safety issues, and that CCS, carbon sequestration, is not yet proven and work is progressing slowly, renewable energy has its work cut out. This is where most of our collective hope lies. How do we do this? I think if we focus on these points, we can get there, possibly even without an agreement in Paris later this year. 1. Reduce costs so the economical argument becomes unavoidable. We're doing this already and are very close to break even. That's without subsidies. Much closer than, for example, Exxon will have you believe. 2. Increase the uptake. We need to build a lobbying strength to counter the carbon industry. Currently, the carbon industry receives more than 10 times the subsidies and tax breaks than renewable energy does. But let's be clear, subsidy is not a gift, it's a government investment in the future. We should not let our governments waste money on an industry of the past and demand those funds get diverted to the future, to renewables. 3. Develop options to make deployment more flexible and comprehensive than any alternatives. If renewables are better than carbon, it'll expand rapidly. And 4. We need to all stand up and make it clear. The only alternative to renewables is using less energy. Other options will destroy our collective future. Climate change is here. It will destroy our world if we let it, and we're letting it at the moment. Widespread implementation of renewables is much of the answer, and now is the time. If you want to learn more, visit aberdeenclimateaction.org.